May 8, 1945. Berlin lay in ruins. The Third Reich had fallen. As Allied forces swept across Germany, Nazi officials faced a simple choice: surrender or vanish. Most chose surrender. But one man, Oberst Heinrich von Waldberg, simply disappeared. For 82 years, his fate remained one of World War II's most perplexing mysteries. Then, in 2027, a routine survey of the Bavarian Alps revealed something extraordinary. Hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, camouflaged by nature itself, was an elaborate underground estate that defied explanation. What investigators found inside would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the final days of Nazi Germany. The discovery began with Dr. Elena Richter, a geological surveyor conducting routine mineral assessments in the remote Berchtesgaden region. Her ground-penetrating radar picked up anomalous readings 200 feet below the surface. The signatures were too geometric, too deliberate to be natural formations. When her team drilled exploratory holes, they struck concrete where no concrete should exist. Within hours, the site was swarming with archaeologists, historians, and federal investigators. Nobody was prepared for what lay beneath. Heinrich von Waldberg wasn't just any Wehrmacht officer. By 1943, he commanded the 47th Alpine Division, an elite mountain warfare unit tasked with defending Germany's southern approaches. Intelligence files described him as brilliant, ruthless, and utterly devoted to Nazi ideology. Unlike many officers who joined the military for tradition or duty, Waldberg was a true believer. He'd risen through the ranks not through family connections, but through sheer competence and unwavering loyalty to Hitler's vision. But there was something else about Waldberg that set him apart. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Allied movements. His division repeatedly escaped encirclement when other units were destroyed. His men spoke of him with a mixture of respect and fear, claiming he could see battles before they were fought. Allied intelligence knew about Waldberg, but they could never pin him down. He was a ghost, always one step ahead. The war's final months found Waldberg's division retreating through the Austrian Alps. Unlike other commanders who fought desperate last stands, Waldberg seemed to be conducting an organized withdrawal toward some predetermined destination. His radio communications became increasingly cryptic. His final confirmed sighting was April 29, 1945, near the village of Mittenwald, just 20 miles from where the underground complex would eventually be discovered. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, Waldberg was nowhere to be found. His division had scattered, his headquarters abandoned. American forces discovered his personal effects in a bombed-out chateau, but the man himself had vanished. Initial investigations assumed he'd died in the chaos of retreat or perhaps escaped to South America like other Nazi fugitives. The case went cold. Heinrich von Waldberg became just another name on a very long list of missing war criminals. But Waldberg hadn't fled to Argentina or Brazil. He hadn't died in some forgotten skirmish. He had been preparing something far more ambitious, something that would challenge our understanding of what was possible in those final desperate days. The entrance to Waldberg's hidden complex was a masterpiece of engineering and deception. Carved into the living rock of the mountain, it was completely invisible from above. The opening was disguised as a natural cave formation, complete with artificial stalactites and carefully placed vegetation. Only ground-penetrating radar could detect the man-made chambers beyond. When investigators finally broke through the sealed entrance, they found themselves in an antechamber that looked like something from a science fiction film. The walls were lined with polished granite. Electric lighting, somehow still functional after 8 decades, illuminated corridors that stretched into the mountain's heart. The air was stale but breathable, maintained by a ventilation system that drew air through hidden shafts carved up through hundreds of feet of solid rock. This wasn't a hastily constructed bunker. This was a long-term refuge, built with precision and extraordinary resources. Dr. Marcus Hoffman, the lead archaeologist on the excavation team, had spent his career studying wartime fortifications. He'd explored bunkers from Normandy to the Eastern Front, but nothing had prepared him for this. "The level of sophistication is unprecedented," he told reporters. "This complex required years of planning and construction. Someone was thinking far ahead." The main corridor led to a series of chambers, each serving a specific purpose. The first room they entered was clearly Waldberg's personal quarters. The space was spartanly furnished, but impeccably maintained. A desk sat against one wall, its surface clean and organized. Above it hung a portrait of Hitler, flanked by military decorations and a ceremonial SS dagger. But it was the map room that truly revealed the scope of Waldberg's ambitions. Covering every wall were detailed topographical maps of Europe, marked with colored pins and hand-drawn notations. Red pins marked Allied positions as of April 1945. Blue pins showed German strongholds. But most intriguing were the green pins, scattered across remote locations throughout the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Carpathian Mountains. Each green pin was numbered and connected by thin red lines to coordinates written in Waldberg's precise handwriting. Investigation of these coordinates would later reveal something extraordinary. Every single location marked by a green pin corresponded to a cache of supplies, weapons, or gold hidden during the war's final months. Waldberg hadn't just been retreating. He'd been establishing a network, preparing for something that would require resources scattered across half of Europe. The complex's communications room contained radio equipment far more sophisticated than standard Wehrmacht gear. Multiple transmitters, receivers, and encoding devices lined the walls. A logbook, maintained until July 1945, documented regular contact with locations across Europe and South America. The final entry, dated July 23rd, consisted of a single line: Phase 1, complete. Initiating Phase 2. No further entries appeared in the book, but the most disturbing discovery was the laboratory. Hidden behind a steel door marked with radiation warning symbols, investigators found a workspace that belonged more in a university than a military bunker. Chemical equipment, microscopes, and centrifuges filled the room. Notebooks documented experiments that seemed to focus on biological agents and chemical compounds. Many of the formulas were written in a code that government cryptographers are still attempting to decipher. Dr. Sarah Chen, a biochemist brought in to analyze the laboratory findings, expressed grave concerns about what she'd observed. "The equipment is extremely sophisticated for 1945, she reported. "Some of these experiments were decades ahead of their time. We're dealing with research that shouldn't have been possible with wartime technology." Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery of detailed files on hundreds of individuals. Each file contained photographs, personal information, family details, and psychological profiles. The subjects weren't random. They were carefully selected scientists, engineers, doctors, and intellectuals from across occupied Europe. Many were Jewish refugees who had supposedly died in concentration camps. Others were resistance fighters who had vanished without explanation. The files suggested something far more sinister than a simple escape plan. Cross-referenced with the supply caches and communication logs, they painted a picture of an organization that extended far beyond one missing colonel. This was evidence of a network that had been planning for Germany's defeat long before the surrender, preparing for something that would require specific people with specific skills. Among the personal files was one that chilled investigators to the bone. It contained detailed plans for what Waldberg called Project Resurrection. The documents outlined a systematic plan to recruit displaced persons, war refugees, and survivors of Nazi atrocities. But this wasn't a rescue operation. The psychological profiles focused on individuals who had lost everything, people who could be molded, controlled, and redirected toward new purposes. The project files described rehabilitation centers hidden throughout the Alps, each designed to house and retrain carefully selected individuals. The centers would be self-sufficient, isolated from the outside world, and completely loyal to a new vision that combined Nazi racial ideology with advanced scientific research. Waldberg wasn't just hiding from justice. He was building something new, something that would outlast the Third Reich itself. But where was Waldberg himself? Despite the complex's obvious long-term habitation, no human remains had been discovered. His personal quarters showed signs of recent use. Food supplies, though preserved by the mountain's cool temperatures, appeared to have been consumed systematically over many years. Yet the man who had built this hidden world was nowhere to be found. The answer lay in the deepest chamber of the complex, a room that required special authorization to access. Behind a vault door that had taken explosives experts 3 days to open, investigators found Waldberg's final secret. The chamber was filled with cryogenic equipment, freezing units that had been operational until recently. Most were empty, but one contained something that would change everything. The investigation of Heinrich von Waldberg's underground estate revealed a mystery far more complex than anyone had imagined. This wasn't the story of a Nazi fugitive hiding from justice. This was evidence of a plan that had been decades in the making, a vision that extended far beyond the war's end. And based on the evidence scattered throughout those mountain chambers, it was a plan that might still be active. Inside the cryogenic unit, suspended in a crystalline chamber filled with preservation fluid, was Heinrich von Waldberg himself. The 82-year-old corpse was perfectly preserved, his uniform still pressed, his face eerily peaceful. But this wasn't a burial. This was something else entirely. Monitoring equipment around the chamber showed readings that suggested the preservation process had been far more sophisticated than simple freezing. Chemical analysis would later reveal that Waldberg's body had been treated with compounds that were decades ahead of 1945 technology. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The preservation techniques used here weren't available until the 1,990 seconds, she reported. Someone has been maintaining this chamber, updating the equipment, keeping the body in perfect condition for over 8 decades. The implications were staggering. Waldberg's hidden complex hadn't been abandoned after the war. Someone had been taking care of it. Security footage from the chamber's monitoring system revealed the truth. The digital files, stored on modern hard drives that had clearly been installed decades after the war, showed regular visits from figures in hazmat suits. The timestamps stretched back to the 1,960 seconds and continued until just months before the complex's discovery. Someone had been visiting Waldberg's preserved corpse for over 60 years, maintaining the equipment, updating the technology, keeping vigil over their frozen leader. The visitors weren't random. Analysis of their movements, their knowledge of the complex's layout, and their methodical maintenance routines suggested military training and deep familiarity with the facility. These weren't curiosity seekers or treasure hunters. These were believers, disciples carrying out some sacred duty to their preserved commander. But who were they, and where had they come from? Investigation of the communication logs provided the first clues. The radio transmissions documented in Waldberg's logbooks hadn't ended in 1945. Cross-referencing frequencies with declassified intelligence reports revealed a pattern of mysterious broadcasts that had puzzled authorities for decades. Coded messages transmitted from remote alpine locations, always brief, always encrypted, always impossible to trace to their source. The messages followed a consistent pattern. Every year on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, and on the anniversary of Germany's surrender, May 8th, signals would emanate from different locations across the European Alps. The transmissions lasted only minutes, but their consistency over decades suggested an organized network maintaining contact across vast distances. Intelligence agencies had logged these broadcasts as curiosities, unexplained phenomena left over from the war. Now they realized they'd been witnessing something far more sinister. Agent Sarah Morrison of the FBI's Art Crime Team had spent years tracking Nazi war criminals and stolen artifacts. When she was brought in to analyze Waldberg's complex, she immediately recognized patterns she'd seen in other cases. "This isn't random," she explained to the investigation team. "The preservation, the maintenance, the communication network, this is a cult. They've been treating Waldberg like some kind of sleeping prophet, waiting for the right moment to wake him up." The evidence supported her theory. Among Waldberg's papers were detailed instructions for his followers, written as if he expected to return from death. The documents outlined specific protocols for maintaining the complex, preserving his body, and continuing his research. Most disturbing were the recruitment guidelines, instructions for identifying and indoctrinating new members into what Waldberg called the Eternal Order. The order wasn't simply a group of Nazi nostalgics. The documents revealed a sophisticated organization with cells throughout Europe and South America. Members were recruited from specific demographics: displaced persons, political refugees, individuals who had lost everything and were searching for meaning. The psychological manipulation techniques described in Waldberg's writings were decades ahead of their time, predating known research into cult indoctrination by years. But the order wasn't just preserving Waldberg's memory. They were continuing his work. Laboratory notes found throughout the complex showed that experiments had continued long after the war's end. Research into biological weapons, mind control techniques, and genetic manipulation had been ongoing for decades. The primitive equipment from 1945 had been gradually replaced with modern instruments, funded through a network of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for the organization. Corporate records seized during the investigation revealed the scope of the order's infiltration into legitimate society. Shell companies spanning 3 continents had been funneling money toward research facilities hidden throughout remote mountain regions. Pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology firms, and defense contractors had unknowingly employed order members in key positions. The network extended far beyond a handful of aging Nazis. This was a multi-generational conspiracy that had been growing stronger for 8 decades. The recruitment files were perhaps the most chilling discovery. Thousands of individuals had been targeted, approached, and gradually drawn into the order's influence. Many were survivors of traumatic events, refugees, war orphans, victims of political persecution. The order preyed on their vulnerability, offering community, purpose, and belonging to people who had lost everything. But membership came with a price. Total devotion to Waldberg's vision and absolute obedience to the organization's leadership. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cult deprogramming specialist brought in to analyze the recruitment materials, was horrified by what she found. "The psychological manipulation techniques are incredibly sophisticated," she reported. "They're using trauma bonding, isolation, and gradual indoctrination to create absolute loyalty. These people aren't just following an ideology. They've been programmed to see Waldberg as a messianic figure who will return to create a perfect world." The order's ultimate goal was revealed in Waldberg's most secret documents, hidden in a vault within the vault. Project Resurrection wasn't just about preserving Nazi ideology. It was about creating a new form of humanity, genetically and psychologically engineered to serve the order's vision of perfection. The preserved body wasn't meant to stay dead forever. Waldberg had believed that advances in medical technology would eventually allow for his resurrection, his return to lead a transformed world. The scientific research hidden in the complex supported this incredible claim. Experiments in cryogenic preservation, genetic engineering, and consciousness transfer had been ongoing since the 1940 seconds. While the technology of 1945 couldn't achieve Waldberg's dream of resurrection, his followers had been patiently working toward that goal for 8 decades. Modern equipment found in the laboratory suggested they were getting close to their objective. Intelligence agencies across Europe began connecting dots that had remained separate for decades. Unexplained disappearances of researchers, mysterious funding for fringe scientific projects, and reports of isolated communes in remote mountain areas suddenly formed a coherent pattern. The order hadn't just survived the war's end. It had thrived, growing stronger and more sophisticated with each passing year. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come. Analysis of the chamber's monitoring equipment revealed that Waldberg's preservation had been more than just storage. The body had been connected to sophisticated life support systems that maintained minimal brain activity. For over 80 years, Heinrich von Waldberg hadn't been completely dead. He had been sleeping, dreaming, waiting for the technology to advance enough to bring him fully back to life. Recent updates to the equipment suggested that moment was approaching rapidly. The Order had spent decades preparing for their leader's return, building a network of followers, accumulating resources, and developing the scientific capabilities necessary to achieve resurrection. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. They were almost ready to wake up their sleeping colonel. The investigation team realized they weren't just uncovering a historical mystery. They were racing against time to prevent something unprecedented in human history. A Nazi war criminal, preserved at the moment of his death, was about to return to a world his followers had spent 8 decades preparing for his arrival. The question was no longer what had happened to Heinrich von Waldberg. The question was what would happen when he came back. The gravity of what investigators had uncovered sent shockwaves through intelligence agencies worldwide. This wasn't just about one preserved Nazi colonel. The Order had been preparing for something that would fundamentally alter the balance of global power. Agent Morrison's team began tracking financial transactions linked to the shell companies, uncovering a web of monetary transfers that painted a terrifying picture of the organization's true reach. Over the past decade alone, nearly $50 million had been funneled through seemingly legitimate channels toward advanced medical research facilities. These weren't backyard laboratories or amateur experiments. The Order had been funding cutting-edge research at prestigious universities and private corporations across 3 continents. Professors and researchers, unaware of their funding sources, had been unknowingly advancing the very technologies needed to achieve Waldberg's resurrection. Dr. Chen's analysis of the laboratory equipment revealed modifications that shouldn't have existed. The cryogenic systems had been upgraded repeatedly over the decades, each iteration more sophisticated than the last. Carbon dating of various components showed a timeline of technological advancement that paralleled mainstream scientific progress. Every breakthrough in medical science, every advancement in biotechnology had been quietly incorporated into Waldberg's preservation chamber. But the equipment served another purpose beyond simple preservation. Hidden within the chamber's complex machinery were devices designed to monitor and stimulate brain activity. Electroencephalogram readings stored in the facility's computer systems showed consistent patterns of neural activity stretching back decades. Waldberg's brain had never stopped functioning. He had been conscious, aware, processing information fed to him through sophisticated neural interfaces. The implications were staggering. For over 80 years, Heinrich von Waldberg had been observing the world's changes, learning about technological advances, studying political developments, and planning his return. The preserved body wasn't just a sleeping figure waiting for resurrection. It was an active participant in the Order's ongoing mission, a strategic mind that had been analyzing and adapting to 8 decades of global change. Computer files recovered from the chamber's monitoring systems contained thousands of hours of recorded audio. The Order's members had been regularly briefing their preserved leader on world events, technological developments, and the organization's progress toward their ultimate goals. Waldberg's responses, transmitted through subtle neural signals, had been guiding the Order's activities for decades. He hadn't just been waiting for resurrection, he had been orchestrating his own return. The briefing recordings revealed the scope of Waldberg's influence on the modern world. Major political events, technological breakthroughs, and social movements had all been subtly influenced by Order members following their leaders' guidance. The organization had learned to play the long game, positioning their people in key locations throughout society, gradually shaping events to create the perfect conditions for Waldberg's return. Dr. Hoffman's team made another disturbing discovery in the complex's deepest chambers. Beyond Waldberg's preservation room lay a series of preparation areas that looked more like surgical suites than historical artifacts. The rooms contained modern medical equipment, genetic sequencing machines, and biotechnology apparatus that belonged in the world's most advanced research hospitals. Someone had been preparing for major medical procedures, and the timeline suggested those preparations were nearly complete. The surgical suites weren't designed for preservation. They were built for restoration. Detailed medical charts found throughout the rooms outlined procedures for repairing decades of tissue damage, integrating modern cybernetic enhancements, and optimizing physical capabilities beyond normal human limitations. The Order wasn't just planning to resurrect their leader, they intended to improve him, creating something that was more than human. Genetic samples stored in the facility's biobank revealed another layer of the Order's preparations. DNA from thousands of individuals had been collected, cataloged, and analyzed over the decades. The samples weren't random. They represented the genetic profiles of people the Order considered ideal specimens, individuals whose biological traits could be incorporated into their leader's restored body. Waldberg wouldn't just return as he was. He would come back enhanced, perfected, superior. Intelligence analysts working around the clock to decode the Order's communications discovered that resurrection preparations had accelerated dramatically over the past year. Encrypted messages between cells showed increasing urgency, references to final preparations, and countdown timelines that pointed toward a specific date. Cross-referencing these communications with astronomical events and historical anniversaries, investigators identified the target, April 20th, 2028, Hitler's birthday, marking exactly 139 years since the Nazi leader's birth. The symbolism wasn't coincidental. The Order viewed this date as the perfect moment for their leader's return, a symbolic rebirth that would launch their vision of a transformed world. But they weren't planning a quiet resurrection. Documents found throughout the complex outlined a coordinated global operation designed to coincide with Waldberg's return. Simultaneous strikes against government facilities, research institutions, and communication networks would create chaos while the Order seized control of key infrastructure. Agent Morrison's investigation revealed that the Order had been placing members in critical positions throughout society for decades. Government agencies, military organizations, technology companies, and media corporations all harbored individuals secretly loyal to Waldberg's vision. The network was vast, sophisticated, and poised to act when their leader gave the signal. Democracy itself was under threat from an enemy that had been hiding in plain sight for 8 decades. The financial trail led to discoveries that shook the investigation team to its core. Major corporations, defense contractors, and research institutions had been unknowingly funding the Order's activities through a maze of shell companies and legitimate-seeming partnerships. Some of the world's most recognizable brands had contributed to developing the very technologies that would enable Waldberg's resurrection. The corruption reached into the highest levels of business and government. But perhaps most terrifying was the discovery of the Order's recruitment acceleration over the past decade. Social media analysis revealed sophisticated psychological operations designed to identify and target vulnerable individuals across the globe. The organization had adapted their recruitment techniques to the digital age, using algorithms and artificial intelligence to find people susceptible to their message of belonging and purpose. Young people struggling with identity, veterans dealing with trauma, refugees seeking community, and individuals facing personal crises had all been systematically approached by order recruiters. The techniques were subtle, often appearing as legitimate support groups or educational opportunities. Only after months of careful grooming would recruits learn the true nature of the organization they had joined. Dr. Vasquez's analysis of recruitment materials revealed that the order had been particularly focused on attracting individuals with specific skill sets. Computer programmers, biotechnology researchers, military specialists, and communications experts had been priority targets. The organization wasn't just seeking believers, they needed technical expertise to support their increasingly complex operations. The recruitment drive had been remarkably successful. Conservative estimates suggested that the order now commanded the loyalty of over 10,000 active members worldwide, with potentially hundreds of thousands more in various stages of indoctrination. Many of these individuals held positions of trust and responsibility in their respective societies, creating a network of influence that extended into every aspect of modern civilization. Security footage from the complex showed that visitation patterns had changed dramatically over the past year. Instead of the occasional maintenance visits that had characterized previous decades, the facility was now receiving multiple visitors each week. The increased activity suggested that final preparations for Waldberg's resurrection were well underway. But the visitors weren't just order members performing maintenance duties. Analysis of their movements and equipment revealed that many were medical professionals, biotechnology experts, and cybernetics specialists. The order had assembled a team capable of performing the most complex medical procedures ever attempted. They weren't just planning to wake up their sleeping leader. They intended to rebuild him entirely. The investigation team realized they were facing an unprecedented threat. For 8 decades, the world had believed that Nazi ideology had been defeated and relegated to history books. In reality, it had been evolving, adapting, and preparing for a return that would make the original Third Reich seem primitive by comparison. Heinrich von Waldberg's resurrection would mark the beginning of something far more dangerous than anything the world had seen before. Time was running out. With less than 6 months remaining before the order's target date, intelligence agencies scrambled to identify and neutralize the network before their plan could be implemented. But the organization had spent 8 decades preparing for this moment. They had anticipated opposition, planned for interference, and prepared contingencies that would ensure their success regardless of government intervention. The race was on to prevent the unthinkable. A Nazi war criminal was about to return from the dead, backed by a global network of followers who had spent their entire lives preparing for his resurrection. The question was no longer whether Heinrich von Waldberg would return to life. The question was whether anyone could stop what would happen when he did. He'd happen when he did. The investigation team's worst fears materialized when they discovered the order's infiltration of Project Lazarus, a classified biotechnology initiative funded by multiple governments under the guise of medical research. For 3 years, taxpayer money had been unknowingly financing the very technologies needed to achieve Waldberg's resurrection. The irony was devastating. Democratic nations had been funding their own potential destruction, paying for research that would soon be turned against them. Dr. Chen's team made a breakthrough when they cracked the encryption on Waldberg's neural interface logs. The preserved kernel hadn't just been passively observing the world's changes, he had been actively learning, absorbing information at an accelerated rate that defied normal human cognitive limits. Language databases, historical records, scientific journals, and classified intelligence reports had all been fed directly into his consciousness over the decades. The learning curve was staggering. Waldberg's mind had processed information equivalent to thousands of university degrees. He understood modern technology better than most contemporary experts. He had studied every major military conflict since World War II, analyzed every political system, and absorbed every scientific breakthrough. When he returned, he wouldn't be a relic from 1945. He would be a strategic genius armed with 8 decades of accumulated knowledge. Agent Morrison discovered that the Order had been systematically recruiting from specific populations with almost surgical precision. Military veterans experiencing post-traumatic stress, brilliant scientists whose research had been rejected by mainstream institutions, and political dissidents who felt betrayed by their governments. Each recruit brought unique skills and deep-seated grievances that the Order expertly exploited and redirected toward their cause. The psychological profiles were masterfully crafted. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL turned biotechnology researcher, had been approached after his experimental work on human enhancement was deemed too controversial by government oversight committees. Sarah Chen, a computer programmer who had lost her family in a terrorist attack, found purpose in the Order's promise of a world without chaos. Thomas Richter, a German industrialist whose grandfather had been executed as a war criminal, saw Waldberg's resurrection as historical vindication. These weren't desperate outcasts or fringe extremists. They were accomplished professionals who had been carefully selected and methodically convinced that conventional society had failed them. The Order offered them something more powerful than money or status. They offered meaning, purpose, and the chance to build something revolutionary. By the time recruits learned the true nature of their mission, they were already emotionally and psychologically committed to the cause. Financial analysis revealed that the Order controlled assets worth over $2 billion, accumulated through decades of careful investment and legitimate business operations. Shell corporations owned everything from pharmaceutical companies to private military contractors. The organization had become a multinational conglomerate, with tentacles reaching into every sector of the global economy. But money was just one tool in their arsenal. The Order had spent decades positioning members in key governmental positions across multiple countries. Intelligence agencies, military commands, and research institutions all harbored individuals secretly loyal to Waldberg's vision. When the time came, these embedded agents would provide crucial support for the organization's global operation. The Preservation Chamber's monitoring systems revealed something that chilled investigators to the bone. Waldberg's brain activity had increased dramatically over the past 6 months. Neural patterns showed heightened alertness, complex processing, and what appeared to be active communication attempts. The sleeping colonel was waking up, becoming more conscious as his resurrection date approached. Dr. Walsh's medical team made a discovery that defied current understanding of human biology. Waldberg's preserved tissue showed signs of regeneration that shouldn't have been possible. Cellular damage from 8 decades of preservation was somehow repairing itself. New neural pathways were forming, muscle tissue was strengthening. The body was preparing itself for resurrection without any external intervention. The implications were terrifying. If Waldberg's consciousness could guide his own physical restoration, what other capabilities might he possess? The boundary between science and something approaching the supernatural was becoming increasingly blurred. The investigation team was dealing with phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about life and death. Intercepted communications between Order cells revealed that preparation sites had been established across 6 continents. Each facility was designed to support specific aspects of the global operation. Research stations in Antarctica continued genetic modification experiments. Mountain complexes in the Himalayas housed training camps for specialized operatives. Urban centers provided logistical support and intelligence-gathering capabilities. The scope was breathtaking. The Order had essentially created a shadow civilization, complete with its own economy, military force, and research infrastructure. They operated independently of national governments, answering only to their preserved leaders' guidance. When Waldberg returned, he wouldn't need to rebuild from nothing. He would inherit a fully functional organization capable of challenging the established world order. Agent Morrison's team identified the Order's most dangerous capability, their mastery of information warfare. For decades, they had been subtly influencing public opinion through carefully planted stories, manipulated data, and coordinated social media campaigns. Major political movements, economic disruptions, and social conflicts showed signs of Order manipulation. They had learned to destabilize societies from within, creating chaos that would ease their eventual takeover. The investigation uncovered evidence that several recent global crises had been orchestrated or amplified by Order operations. Financial markets had been manipulated to fund their activities. Political movements had been influenced to create social division. Even natural disasters had been exploited to test their crisis response capabilities. The organization had been using the entire world as a testing ground for their eventual global coup. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Project Genesis, the Order's plan for post-resurrection society. The documents outlined a complete restructuring of human civilization based on Waldberg's enhanced vision of genetic and psychological perfection. Democratic governments would be replaced by a hierarchical system based on genetic merit. Individual freedoms would be subordinated to collective efficiency. Technology would be used to monitor and control every aspect of human behavior. The Genesis protocols weren't abstract theories. They were detailed implementation plans supported by decades of research and testing. The Order had identified specific populations for elimination, relocation, and genetic modification. They had designed new urban centers optimized for surveillance and control. They had even planned the systematic re-education of existing populations to accept their new reality. Timestamps on the Genesis files showed that planning had accelerated dramatically over the past year. Final preparations were being made for immediate implementation following Waldberg's resurrection. The Order wasn't planning to gradually seize power. They intended to transform the world overnight, using their embedded agents and prepared infrastructure to establish complete control before anyone could organize effective resistance. The medical equipment in Waldberg's chamber showed signs of recent calibration and testing. Biotechnology experts determined that the resurrection procedure could be initiated at any time. The Order was simply waiting for their chosen date, allowing anticipation to build among their members while putting finishing touches on their global operation. Dr. Hoffman's team made one final discovery that crystallized the magnitude of what they faced. Hidden in the complex's deepest vault was a collection of artifacts that defied explanation: ancient symbols, archaeological specimens, and scientific instruments that seemed to blend cutting-edge technology with historical mysticism. The Order's beliefs weren't based purely on Nazi ideology. They had incorporated elements from various occult traditions, creating a hybrid philosophy that viewed Waldberg as something approaching a messianic figure. The investigation team realized they weren't just fighting a sophisticated terrorist organization. They were confronting a cult that had spent 8 decades preparing for what they believed would be a supernatural transformation of human civilization. Logic, evidence, and conventional tactics might not be sufficient to stop people who viewed their mission as a sacred destiny ordained by forces beyond normal understanding. With less than 5 months remaining until April 20th, 2028, intelligence agencies worldwide began the most complex counterterrorism operation in history. They had identified the threat, mapped the network, and understood the timeline. But the Order had spent 8 decades preparing for exactly this kind of interference. They had contingency plans, backup systems, and redundant capabilities that would ensure their success even if their primary operations were compromised. The race to prevent Heinrich von Waldberg's resurrection had become a battle for the future of human civilization itself. One side possessed the resources of democratic nations and the urgency of desperation. The other had the advantage of time, preparation, and absolute conviction in their cause. The outcome would determine whether the world moved forward into an uncertain but free future, or backward into a nightmare that would make the original Third Reich seem like a mere rehearsal for the main event. The discovery of Heinrich von Waldberg's hidden estate has shattered our understanding of history itself. What began as a routine geological survey in the Bavarian Alps uncovered a conspiracy that spans 8 decades, revealing that one of World War II's most dangerous minds never truly died. Instead, he has been waiting, learning, and orchestrating a return that threatens everything we thought we knew about the modern world. The evidence is undeniable. A global network of followers, billions in funding, cutting-edge technology decades ahead of its time, and a preserved consciousness that has been actively planning humanity's transformation. The Order's infiltration reaches into the highest levels of government, business, and science. Their preparation is complete. Their timeline is set. April 20th, 2028 approaches with terrifying inevitability. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that this isn't just about one man's resurrection. It's about the systematic replacement of human freedom with engineered perfection, democratic choice with genetic hierarchy, individual thought with collective control. Heinrich von Waldberg didn't just survive the fall of Nazi Germany. He evolved beyond it, creating something far more dangerous than the world has ever faced. The investigation continues as intelligence agencies race against time to dismantle a network that has spent nearly a century preparing for this moment. But one question haunts everyone involved in this discovery. If the Order has anticipated every form of opposition, planned for every contingency, and embedded themselves so deeply into our society, can they actually be stopped? Or are we already too late to prevent the unthinkable from becoming reality? The mountains have finally revealed their secret. Now the world must decide what to do with the truth. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.